Good morning, everybody. It's my third start here. This is a PowerPoint lecture on intelligence and intelligence testing. I'm going to cover a few things today. The three problems with it. What is it? Definition, three theories, measuring intelligence, what makes a good test, standardizing a test, and the normal curve. Very briefly, but importantly, there are three main problems with the subject of intelligence. One is just defining what it is. There's no total consensus on what intelligence is. Second, how to measure it, which if you don't know what it is, you would have trouble with measuring it. And the third is the role of heredity versus environment in terms of determining intelligence. As we go through, keep those are pretty fundamental problems, so keep those in mind. I think prior to starting the lecture, you guys all came up with your own and a class definition of intelligence. So we can refer back to that. As I started with, we know intuitively that intelligence is a thing. Like it takes intelligence to solve problems and to think things through, and some people are quicker at that and better at that than others. So it's a thing that exists, but it is not tangible and concrete like eye color or how fast you are. It's a social construct. It is something that we have constructed, and it at its core is just whatever enables success in a particular culture, particular time and place, and particular circumstances. On the background of this definition is a clip from the film Apollo 13. It's one of my favorite movie scenes. A bunch of engineers down in Houston are stuck in a room and told to deal with a problem up on the lunar module of the Apollo 13 spacecraft. The astronauts are stuck up there, can't get home, and the air filtration system is going to break down, and so they have to take the square thing and fit it into a round hole, and they only have the items that are on the table before them. And that's not something you can really train for or plan for. It's make do with what you have and make it work. And that's kind of gets at what intelligence is. Robert Sternberg, one of the key thinkers in terms of intelligence, says his definition is that intelligence revolves around mental attributes that involve information processing, so learning from experience, gaining knowledge from experience, problem solving, and adapting to change. And that kind of leads to the accepted consensus definition. A year ago I was in South Africa, and we got taken on a bushwalk, and the guide kind of showed us around different plants and what they could be used for. One plant was useful for being made into a toothbrush. Another plant was useful for stopping bleeding, and he had this vast knowledge of what you could do with the different plants and the environment in order to survive. In that, and this was a very obviously kind of primitive village. In that environment, he's would be considered intelligent, and those of us who were visiting, not. Now, maybe we could quickly adapt, and that would show our intelligence, but it gets at the kind of vague nature of intelligence, that it depends on certain time and place, what you need to be able to do in order to survive. So here's the actual definition, and it's just kind of based on what Sternberg said. The ability to learn from one's experiences, the ability to acquire knowledge, and the ability to use resources effectively in adapting to new situations or solving problems. So keep that kind of three-part piece to it in your head. There are three main theories of intelligence: Spearman's, Sternberg's, and Gardner's. They differ fundamentally, Spearman's from the other two mostly, in terms of what they think intelligence is and how many types of intelligence there are. So Spearman had the G factor, Sternberg's was the triarchic theory, three types of intelligence, and Gardner had multiple intelligences. That's a picture of Spearman in the background. Sorry, I meant to show these bit by bit, but we're just going to go, I think I forgot to do that. So we're just going to keep going with this. And the background on the left is Sternberg, and on the right is Howard Gardner. So Spearman, this guy, is from about 100 years ago, and the beginning of psychological testing. And his theory of intelligence is based on the psychometrics. So that is the measuring of psychological testing. So he looked at how people did on the early intelligence tests or cognitive tests, and he found that despite that people were being tested for slightly different stuff, whether it was fluid reasoning or verbal ability or mathematical reasoning, there's a correlation, and it varied, so maybe at times like 40% between the different, how people would score on the different tests. And so what he concluded is that there's an underlying G factor, or general intelligence, that comes out in every test. So that's where the G factor came from. And he used factor analysis, which we talked about in personality testing. And just to recap, you should know what factor analysis is. It's when you take a whole bunch of results, like Gordon Allport had that there are 200 different personality traits, and you look for latent factors or underlying variables that determine those 200 factors. And Cattell got it down with factor analysis to 16 personality factors. So that's what Spearman was trying to do on his intelligence testing, was get it down to is there one underlying intelligence? And that's what he came up with, is that there is one thing that you can call general intelligence. And he was careful to say G indicated the correlation. It's just a statistical measure, the correlation between scores on different tests. But how it's generally thought of is that it is people's kind of basic intelligence. And that's an idea that is probably the dominant idea about intelligence, that there is one underlying intelligence. You either have a lot of it or some of it or not much. He also talked about S, specific task-based intelligence, like being good at business or being good at art or music or something like that. And he thought there was some correlation between G and S, but the focus was on G. And that determined and drove a lot of the intelligence testing for up into the 70s and 80s, and even today. Sternberg is different. He didn't take a statistical approach. He took a more cognitive approach, trying to analyze what are the types of intelligence. And he came up with three: analytical or problem-solving intelligence, which would be measured on an IQ test somewhat; creative intelligence, which is the ability to compose and create new things, has a lot of overlap with divergent thinking, but not 100%. And then practical intelligence, the ability to get along in the world, to kind of read people and manage situations. Um, Criticisms of Sternberg's theory are that it's not very empirical, and that practical intelligence can be measured on the IQ tests. I don't find that last criticism very believable. I think that's not true, but that is a criticism. And then in the 80s, Howard Gardner came along and rejected the whole field of IQ testing and the kind of standard theories of intelligence, and said there are many different kinds of intelligences. He ended up coming up with 8 or 9. And his theory was cognitive as well, not so much psychometric, but he established 8 criteria for what meant something was an actual intelligence. And you don't have to know the criteria, but just as an example, one is that it has to be an isolatable part of the brain. That is, like, so if you got brain damage in a specific area, that would affect a specific type of intelligence. And you know that, like, there's a verbal linguistic section of the brain and the spatial section and things like that. He thought it had to be expressible symbolically, so susceptible to encoding, meaning you could, note it in some form of like language or like a musical language or something like that. He thought there had to be an evolutionary purpose or basis for it, and he thought you needed to there needed to exist savants or people with extreme giftedness in that area. And so he came up with his 9: verbal linguistic, musical, logical, mathematical, etc. You see them there. So the first 4 are pretty standard, but then he added kinesthetic intelligence, or the ability to move and control your body well. And we just saw, some of you have been paying attention to the Winter Olympics, and that would, the snowboarders and figure skaters would have high kinesthetic intelligence, according to Gardner. Interpersonal, kind of people skills, we would call it. Intrapersonal, knowing yourself. And I think even up to those 7, most people would buy in that those are specific things that people have varying levels of competency in. I think naturalist and existentialist is a little more troublesome for people, and I'll leave that to you to decide which ones you buy into. For Gardner, his theory really shook up, especially the education world, and it's something that most teachers would tend to latch onto as, okay, there are people with varying levels of ability, and there are different ways to be smart. His theory is still controversial. Are they intelligences or are they abilities? Being able to read people, does that make you intelligent, or is that just a skill? And it gets back to that fundamental disagreement over, well, what is intelligence? So that's an overview of the definition of intelligence and the 3 theories. And as you think about the 3 theories, it gets back to that controversy over and the lack of consensus over what is exactly intelligence. On to the second big problem, measuring intelligence. It began in France about a little over 100 years ago with Alfred Binet, and he took the idea of chronological age, how old you are in years, and added the concept of mental age. What are the things that a typical 15-year-old can do, or problems they can solve? What are the things that a typical 8-year-old can do? And so that was mental age. And he came up with the idea of an intelligence quotient, which is your mental age divided by your chronological age multiplied by 100. And that became the original basis for IQ. Actually, Terman did that, I'm sorry. And Terman developed the Stanford-Binet test. It's Stanford because that's where Terman was based, and he took Binet's original test and modified it. And the Stanford-Binet test tested on 5 dimensions of cognitive ability. You don't need to memorize them, but I put them there just so you have some idea what we're talking about. Fluid reasoning, knowledge, quantitative processing, visual spatial processing, and working memory. Some of you may be sharp and notice that, well, not that knowledge is a weird thing to test in terms of intelligence. And just keep in mind that contradiction, that knowledge is something you can acquire. Intelligence is kind of raw native ability. Someone who's ignorant doesn't have a lot of a lot of knowledge, but they could be very intelligent. They just haven't been exposed to and haven't learned much yet. So that's a weird thing to include on an intelligence test. The SB5 is a Stanford-Binet 5, the 5th edition of the test, and that's the one, the most recent one. It is used less than it used to be, and David Wexler is a contemporary researcher who's been working in the field for years, and he came up with tests that were suited for specific age groups. And the Wexler tests are the most common tests today, and you've probably at some point in your life taken one, or some variation of it. There's the Wexler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children. We're on the 4th version of that, so it's the WISC-4, and then one for preschool kids. And it tests 4 dimensions: verbal, perceptual, working memory, and processing speed. What do you need to know about this brief history of them? You need to know that Binet started it. You need to understand the simple formula for IQ. You need to have some familiarity with Terman and Wexler, and just recognize the tests, if not memorize them. In terms of measuring, what should you know? You need to know what makes a good test. You need to know what it means to standardize a test, and you need to understand what it means to call something a norm reference test. And those might sound like topics that are going to throw you, but they're pretty straightforward. 2 things make a good test: reliability and validity, and you should be thoroughly comfortable with both terms. The textbook does a good job going through them. I don't know if you've ever heard the term necessary and sufficient. So a necessary condition is something that must be present for something to be true. A sufficient condition is something that by itself, if it's true, that's enough. So reliability and validity are both necessary, and together they are sufficient to make a good test. But individually, they're not sufficient. So what makes a test reliable is that you get the same results testing the same person over time. Different researchers are going to get the same results, etc. So that's reliability. Validity is basically, does the test measure what it is supposed to measure? IQ tests tend to be very reliable, but not necessarily very valid. So you could see whether height is a good measure of intelligence, and you would get the same results over and over. That somebody who is tall tends to, is there any correlation between height and intelligence? Probably not, but you're going to get the same results that, people are going to score the same over and over again because height doesn't change. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a valid measure of intelligence. Okay, standardized testing, everybody's favorite thing. The general term, a standardized test, is any test that has the same questions given to everybody and is given in a similar manner, like same amount of time, and same number of options for answers and things like that, and then consistent scoring. So it doesn't have to be a multiple choice test, but the scoring has to be objective and consistent across test takers. So that's a standardized test. A norm reference test just means that the results are compared to a standardized group or a norm. So in a norm reference test, you administer things under give everybody the same test conditions. So it's a type of standardized test. But first, you have administered the test to a representative sample, sometimes called the norm group, sometimes called the standardization group. That representative sample, the scores that they came up with are called the norms. Those are your standard scores, and those are terms you've probably heard before. So a norm reference test just means that your raw score is compared to the comparison standards, and your raw score doesn't actually matter. It is where do you fall in compared to the norms, compared to that standardization group. So in a norm reference test, your scores are reported as a percentile or percentage ranking. You scored in the 70th percentile means you scored higher than 70% of the students in the norming group. You should be familiar with that. Like, make sure you're comfortable with that concept. A second idea, and it unfortunately has a similar root, is most intelligence tests follow a normal distribution. So there's norm referencing, which is comparison to a group standard, and then there is a normal distribution, which is, that things follow that standard of dispersion, that in a normal curve about 68% of the group falls within one standard deviation away from the mean. So just recall, we have measures of central tendency, mean, median, mode. We have measures of variation and dispersal, and standard deviation is one way to measure how dispersed are the results. There's a connection between the normal curve and standard deviation. In a normal curve, that dispersal follows a typical pattern. At some point, and I'm not sure when, test designers replaced that old ratio IQ, mental age over chronological age times 100, with deviation IQ scores. So where do your scores on a test fall compared to, I am low battery, got to wrap this up. Where do your scores fall compared to that norm group? So that's what a deviation IQ score is. Just plug it in here. Give me a little bit more time to wrap up. And that's it. So let's recap. What are the 3 problems with intelligence? You should know that. I really only covered 2, and in your reading you're going to start tackling the 3rd one. Defining what it is, the 3 theories on intelligence, and the issues with measuring it. In terms of what's next, what did I do? Sorry. Let's go through that one more time. I apologize. You've got reading on the extremes of intelligence, and then on the very controversial issue of heredity and environment. That's it. I will see you in class on Wednesday. Hope you had a good break, and that you make progress while I'm gone. Talk to you soon. Bye.